Hey, this is Kurt Isles. As always, I want to welcome you to the Creek Bank. We're here at Creek Bank Stories, and as always, we're coming to you from the old house in Dry Creek. I'm sitting on the dog trot porch where I've always written, where I sat with my grandparents and great grandparents when I was a boy. We're at the end of Clayton Isles Road, the dead end road I grew up on. My mom's house is about 200 yards to the kind of the northwest of us. And then Crooked Bayou Swamp is to the west of us here. I'm glad you're here today. I want to remind you that you can always find out more about our writing at creekbank.net. That's creekbank.net. You can find out about our writing, our books, YouTube podcast, blog, Facebook, everything we do, you can find out about it. And we'd be tickled if you stop by. Now, before we start today's story, Barefooting, I want to say a few things. I want you to view this right now as a conversation. Here's the way I look at it. I'm just sitting here on the porch in my chair, and I feel like you're just sitting there. We're just talking. And because it's a conversation, sometimes while I'm doing this, I'll clear my throat or wipe sweat off my face or some word to come out sideways. Don't worry about that. If it's a real conversation, we would give each other grace that you don't have to have everything perfect, but we do want it to be good. And I think the story you're going to hear today, Barefooting, you'll agree, is not just a good story, it's a great story. I named it Barefooting because this is a story of, I think, one of the most overlooked heroes of the Piney Woods, the circuit riding preacher who was named Paul Leeds. Most of you have never heard about him, but after this story, you'll know about him. Reverend Leeds was he was a circuit riding pastor here in the Piney Woods area from about 1890 to 1920 when he circuit riding. And then after that, he was pastor at the First Congregational Church in Kinder, and he ministered here in our part of the state till the 1950s. But it was about a 30-year period when the timber was being cut throughout the Piney Woods that he was a circuit riding preacher. Let me tell you something about him, and I'll tell a story. He came down from the north. He'd been sent down here to be a missionary. And got down here, he had no idea what to do. He was a Yankee. He looked like a preacher. He dressed like a preacher. And that day, preachers dressed a certain way. And he just found that it wasn't going to be easy getting to know these people, especially when he started going out into the logging camps. Now, in the late 19th century, you had the big sawmills like at Mab and Fullerton and Bonamy, Hoy. These were huge sawmills that employed thousands of people, but most logging operations were small logging camps along Wiskachita and Calcasieu and Bundick's Creek. And men or families would live in these camps, and they would cut down longleaf pines with oxen, and they used wagons. They'd drag these big pines to the river. They dump them in. The place they dumped them in was called a dump. And then they'd always mark these logs with either a brand or some kind of stamp which showed who it belonged to. And when they got enough logs in the river, they would make a raft. And then when they got enough rafts, they'd make what's called a pen. A pen was a stack of rafts together. And they waited until the rivers got high, usually in the spring. And then the men would pole these rafts down to Calcasieu to Lake Charles out on the actual lake where there were 8 sawmills running during this heyday of the lumber business. And I've always wished I could live back then and went on one of those raft rides. If you've ever read my novel, A Good Place, the main character in there his name is Mayo Moore, and he takes a memorable log craft ride down the Calcasieu to Lake Charles. Now, here's what would happen. Those men would get to Lake Charles, they'd sell their logs, have their money, and then they had got to get back home, probably a 40-mile journey. Some would buy a horse or a mule and load up supplies. Sadly, some of them would blow their money, getting drunk and doing all kinds of things. Others who didn't want to spend money on an animal would walk back. And so they get back home and start this cycle again. They get this picture. There's a logging camp way down in Wiskachita Swamp, and the people are having a chimney raising. Now, chimney raisins where all the people in the community would come together for a new log cabin. They'd build a chimney. These chimneys were made out of mud long before we had bricks in this area. And what they'd do is the men would first all build a skeleton out of twigs and limbs. And then when they got that built, they would start in with the mud. And to do the mud, you had this red clay mud that they would dig, and they'd make a pit. In there, they'd put pine straw because you wanted to have that pine straw as a filler. And one of the big jobs at a chimney raisin was mud daubing, getting in that pit, and just like they do wines, just getting in there and just stomping that straw and that mud together. Here's the story Brother Leeds told on himself in his memoir, Pataran. I'll tell you more about his book in a minute. He said he rode up to this camp, and there he was. He was on his horse, dressed like a preacher, had a coat and tie. He was in nice clothes. And he got off his horse and said, everyone there stop. The men up in the chimney, the women who were washing, the kids who were in the daubing pit, they stopped and looked because they knew this was an outsider. They were someone different. He said he took his coat off and put it on his saddle, rolled up his pants, took off his shoes, and went straight to the mud daubing pit and got in there with the kids and started stomping around. And Paul Leeds, the apostle to the piney woods, had arrived. And what he did, he made a connection. He said he was never a stranger again at that logging camp. Anytime he came, he took him in. And that started because he was willing to go barefoot and get in there among people. I think there's so many principles to that about barefooting. You know, Dee Dee and I, we spent 3 years in Africa, and we weren't there to really preach. We were there to do research on people groups. And so we would spend about 2 to 3 weeks up in the bush in northern Uganda, and we'd be among a bunch of different tribes, and we would want to learn about these tribes, their language, their culture, what they believed, and we would write reports and bring it back home. And so most of the time, I didn't do much preaching. I did a lot of listening and a lot of learning, and we called it ground truthing. Ground truth is when you look on the ground and make sure you know what's going on. And the greatest compliment to an African missionary who'd been there a long time was to say, he's a barefoot missionary. And what that meant is he got out among the people. And what Dee Dee and I found that we were outsiders. We were Mzungus. We were white people. And there was a lot of suspicion when we went into these places where Mzungus hadn't been. Always had a pastor with us. He knew the language and the culture, but we were there. Here's what we found. If you go barefooting with people, if you get in there and sit in their huts, talk with them, listen to them, eat their food, laugh with them, all of a sudden they will connect with you because barefooting always connects people together. Whether it's in the piney woods with Paul Leeds, or whether it's in a refugee camp among the Kakwa in northern Uganda, barefooting is such an important thing. Now, I know some of you think, well, I'm not going to be a circuit riding preacher, or I'm not going to be an African missionary. What's it had to do with me? I think barefooting applies to all of us, that we need to get out and get among the people. In our job we had in Africa, I spent time on Google Maps and Google Earth and reading and looking at all kinds of stuff, but that could not replace ground truthing, getting on the ground, and barefoot and get out among the people. And I want to encourage you, wherever you are in your life, whatever season you're in, whatever you're doing, get out there and do some barefooting. Get out there among people. Get to know them. Get out among some people who are different than you and go barefooting with them. One of my favorite quotes from Brother Leeds was later on in his life, they asked one of the loggers about him, that he was up north, and this logger in his own way of talking said, Reverend Leeds, he weren't no Yankee. He's one of us. And you know, for Piney Woods people to say that about you is the greatest compliment that can be. Now, I mentioned a while ago that there's a book that is called Pataran. Listen to the name. It's very unusual. If you read the book, you'll find out about what a Pataran is. But that's the name of his memoir. And Reverend Leeds left behind his memoir notes Miss Catherine Johnson from Reeves, Louisiana, put together the book called Padawan. It's a combination of history of his work, and what I enjoy most is about his memoirs of making these trips through the piney woods, sometimes by horseback, sometimes on foot. And it is a wonderful read because he goes to all the little communities that I grew up in. I know all the places he started churches. A lot of the churches he started now are called Bible churches, and they're throughout Southwest Louisiana. Reverend Leeds was something else. He was a very, very special man, and I would encourage you, if you can, to get hold of Padawan. Here's another story on it. I had a out of print copy I got years ago, and it had been out of print for a long time, the book. And it just bothered me that it wasn't out there because it's such a fine book. And so I talked to some different people about it. I said, someone needs to get together and republish Padawan as a modern publication. And I think it's some people from Camp Pearl took it on. But anyway, they got with Wise Printing in Sulphur, Louisiana, and they turned out an updated version of Padawan. The book looks great. And inside, it's just the same story of Paul Leeds, the barefooting, circuit riding preacher of the Piney Woods. They say this, and I'll go. He tells a lot of stories in there about terms he used. And in one of his stories, he says, I was going from one camp to the next camp, and it got dark on me. I had to make a hog bed. And what a hog bed was, is you ever been out in the woods where hogs would sleep, they always would shuffle up a bunch of pine straw and lay on it. And here he was, that Yankee preacher, all dressed up, sleeping on the ground on a hog bed. Hey, I want to encourage you, as you go barefooting, get out there and do it. We're glad you've joined us today at the Creek Bank. We always love sharing stories. I want to remind you, this story you just heard today will be featured in our upcoming short story book called Where I Come From, and it will be entitled Barefooting. I think you'll enjoy it because there's a lot more to the story than I told you today. Well, we'll be back in a week with another story. Until then, here at the Old House, we'll leave the screen unlatched just for you.